Hi, Jessica Nadav, bringing you this week's Davar Torah for Parashat Tetzaveh. Please forgive me, it might be a little bit of noise. We're in a hotel lobby in Israel and it's a little noisy here, but I'm doing my best. I apologize in advance for any noise. So, this week's Parashat Tetzaveh. It's a curious parasha. Moshe is not mentioned by name at all, even though we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is specifically speaking to him. And names matter. Think about the name of the book of the Torah that we're currently reading. Shemot, meaning names. We know that names are important because God spoke each thing into creation when He created the world. He spoke them in by name. And yet here we have not a mention of Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, the greatest human that ever lived. Seemingly Davka, he's not mentioned. It seems to be specifically he's not mentioned by name. Instead we have an entire chapter, 43 Pesukim, 43 verses, about clothes. Not just any clothes, but the clothes of the Kohanim. And the Kohen Gadol, with Aharon and his sons being mentioned repeatedly. Again, seemingly Davka. It feels like it's Davka that they're mentioned again and again. It says Aharon and his sons repeatedly. So let's try and look at both these elements separately and see what they're telling us. You'll see that they both bring us back to the same message. So firstly, let's look at the idea of clothes. We're told that clothes maketh a man. But in Torah, the whole idea of having to wear clothes comes from Adam and Chava, who after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, realize that they are naked and cover themselves. Clothes therefore remind us of the original downfall of humankind, the first sin against Hashem's word. Since then we've been trying to return to a state of Gan Eden and a spiritual existence near HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is therefore no coincidence that the word for clothes is begadim, which has the same letters as the word bogdim, which means traitors or rebels. Clothes are capable of hiding or disguising who we truly are. More than that, they permit us to portray ourselves to be completely the opposite of who and what we are. How often do we pass judgment on our fellow human beings based on the way they look, on the way they're dressed? How often have we heard of people hiding in plain sight because people have judged them to be more respectable than they are based on how they dress and portray themselves to the outside world? Indeed, we're fast approaching the festival of Purim, in which children dress up in fancy dress to remind us of the nahafochu, the turnabout of events, how things looked one way but ended up being completely the opposite. Clothes play a huge role in dressing things up one way when they are in reality another. Tetzaveh is often Parashat Zachor, the Shabbat before Purim. Certainly in the Megillah, clothing is an important element of the narrative. We see this with Vashti, with Achashverosh, with Mordechai, Esther, and of course, Haman. Boo! As an example, there is the obvious link between Tetzaveh with the stress on clothing. In fact, the parasha uses the words lechavod ultifaret for glory and splendor to describe the Kohen's garments. In the Megillah, the same words appear to describe the banquet of Achashverosh. Beharoto et osher kevod malchuto ve'et yekar tiferet gedulato. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty. It says in the Megillah. The Gemara remarks that Achashverosh used the vestments of the Bet HaMikdash and the clothes of the Kohanim at his own feast. Tetzaveh is the parasha of Aharon HaKohen. We know Aharon practiced Ohev Shalom Ve'Rodef Shalom, loving peace and pursuing peace. However, it goes deeper than that. Aharon was aware that human beings are different from one another and that those differences are what makes us unique. In essence, the less one is threatened by one's uniqueness and difference, the further you are from Sinat Chinam, from baseless hatred. This was Aharon exactly. He epitomized Ahavat Chinam, baseless love, or love just because. Exactly what we've been talking about in the last few weeks. Mitzvot ben Adam lechavero, mitzvot between man and man. That's what Aharon epitomized. Now let's go back to the issue of names. I haven't forgotten to come back to that. And Moshe not being mentioned at all. This has been commented on many times. Probably one of the first explanations we're given when we're young is based on a statement in the Zohar that Moshe's name was omitted in response to his declaration in the aftermath of the episode of the Golden Calf, that if God were to destroy the rest of Bnei Israel and build a new nation starting with Moshe Rabbeinu himself, he says, blot me please out of your book, Moshe says to Hashem. So Moshe's name was omitted, blotted out as it were, from one parasha, just as he had asked to be, teaching us that we should be careful with our words, be careful what we ask for. Rav Shor answers by explaining that, in fact, when people have an intimate relationship, when they're close, they don't require the use of first names to address each other. Moshe is as close as any human being can possibly be to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore there is no need for names here. What Rav Shor is saying is completely the opposite of what we suggested earlier. Moshe is not being blotted out of the book by way of punishment, but by way of respect. He's saying that the fact that Moshe's name does not appear is because he was willing to give up everything for Bnei Israel. So he was rewarded for standing up for them. Moshe is not addressed by name because he cared for Bnei Israel so totally and completely, without a sense of self, without a sense of ego, nothing whatsoever. And for that he merited to become close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Names are important, but there are situations where we can surpass the separateness, the ego, and the need for difference, move towards the us together to develop something more powerful for a much higher purpose. However, developing intimacy in our relationships requires action, as we've been at pains to say already. It requires action. The Torah has mapped out an all-encompassing system for us for the development and maintenance of all our relationships through mitzvot ben adam lemakom, between God and man, or man and God I should say, but rather, and even more so with mitzvot ben adam lechavero, the commandments between man and man. I've mentioned before that just as on Yom Kippur, also known as Yom HaKippurim or Yom Kippurim, a day likened to Purim, one must correct their relationships with their fellow human beings before they stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu asking for forgiveness. So too the mitzvot on Purim aim to bring us closer to our fellow human beings. Perfecting our commandments between man and man, perfecting our commandments, mitzvot ben adam lechavero, are lessons we obtain from both brothers, Moshe and Aharon, each in their unique way. Shabbat Shalom and Purim Sameach.